So the procedures.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're the leader.
I've seen it all over. That's so good to see you.
Yeah. We were talking about the other decision.
Yeah, sure.
They both got.
Do you
We're also doing that.
did you want to take, there was originally a table, but I said, do we have to have a table? Is it okay to, are you okay to have a table? I feel like you like I really wish we had company chairs.
Anyway, I was just.
If you want to come and pull it up, then I'll have it ready. Randy does.
I was gonna go.
Just watch your step here, kind of catching you by surprise.
Because I'm not gonna be here. Just to kind of keep it on. Yes.
I have connections with other people that are part of it, like they're. So I just wondered.
So anyway, you're trying to speak the same. It's all consent. Yeah, not that you.
Thank you very much. I just last night came. I'm not even saying anything. I'm just making observations because it's actually, and you might have seen, I just said, oh, I did. This is actually three different speeches on this webpage, and they're all getting, they're kind of getting merged together, collective, like the speech, you know, you might have seen with the red background and everything. Like that is, he didn't say any of this stuff at that speech.
Josh, does anybody
But
want?
because he said that stuff right before that speech, with the red background, oh, but now he's like, so it's really interesting how, I was like, I had so I went to Walt's speech to hear the context of that Semi-Fascist. Zane in there, and I listened to it again, and I was like, oh. Oh, it was a different, so it was like just the collective narratives that we build are so interesting to examine constantly, you know, but history is constantly moving. Yeah. Even really recent history. It's one of the things that I think you're gonna go first, right? Okay. Yeah, I think we do the definition of like you know, context, and then I'll go in with this is how historically we define this, and then here are the parts that make us go, oh, that seems familiar. Just kind of and so I think I think that would. Yeah. And I'll explain where all this comes from. the three siblings.
Yeah, and I have the, since Holocaust, I think that's a page, it's the definition of fascism. And I was like,
Oh, okay, good. I just double checked it.
I know, I was like, oh no, what did they do?
show that to you as we go. I read that they were going to scan those streets. So
Yeah, maybe.
I just had one quick question on your PowerPoint. So, is this, so is that supposed to be?
This is supposed to be.
Yeah, sure. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. So it should be like this versus right. Yeah, that the next page was our reaction.
This is pretty spot on. I just want to make sure I'm there's if I could find it, I thought about this last night and then totally forgot about it until just now. There's a scholar that has like the top 10, like the levels of genocide. And he was like, when he gave the speech, 2018, he was like, we're like, yeah, it was kind of terrifying. But I don't know.
Ask Josh. Josh knows how. I have a big, but Josh is here. He definitely knows how.
Oh, they are. I've only been in here at night, so I've never been in here.
It started like.
Oh, yeah.
It started to creep up on some of the chairs in the audience.
I think this is a great space.
I love this in here. This is where we usually.
We used to read apparently we're the black box next to each other. That's what Josh said. You should. You know that we're going to let you do it, right? No, you should stop. Just practice with just with Pete. I'm happy to sit down with his mind.
I feel very exposed.
I can't.
Right. I don't want to say too much because I'm not gonna, it's gonna be. Yeah.
Is that the idea, 6 to 7 minutes?
Well, there was something about 6 to 7 minutes. I was like, okay, I'm sure.
Yes, she's blaming me. Mine was like 45 minutes. I just read on it for like.
There's a lot of legal history.
Yeah.
Development,
I think it was like 45.
you were covering all the Supreme Court cases.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, that was very complex.
I was just trying to avoid like some of the discussions that I
I
wanted
love discussions.
I mean, they should sign it. Yeah. Okay.
I can breathe.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Mitch.
Consider you. Or do you need? I do remember those days.
I don't expect it to. I haven't seen them yet, but I think. And keep sending. It's not charged. It was 27. I haven't paid it. On the way to school. It was started 101. I was like, I'm sure it's going to be somebody in another department meeting brought my attention, but I had started saying. Maybe that's why I was freaked out. Yeah. And I was like, I'm sure it says. Yeah, sure. What it's like. That's okay. I sent out the right things and then. Yeah, that I'm supposed to be in charge of, so I was just kind of super. And I was like, do this. Yeah. today I taught. So I felt like I actually took the day off from the school. Yeah, around 6 months. Yeah, it's gonna be get to the place where you're like, it's done. Yeah, and that's what matters. Yeah. Which is kind of where I was in my dissertation by the time I got to it. Yeah.
So when you guys are finished, if you give this signal, we'll now open it up for questioning. We'll walk around, questions in the audience, and alternate with Josh. So we have a mic.
Josh Meyer, we said we didn't need one.
I don't think we need one clear. I'll ask him. Yeah.
There's
We
one.
will chop.
I'm gonna go talk to Kate for a second.
Randomly, a maintenance guy showed up at my office today. Put in the maintenance request. Yeah, but I don't know how to do it.
I didn't do that.
That's one of those things.
It looked like one of those angry, but it's they have different heads. That's what it looked like. It's ready. I'm not gonna get any more ready in the next 2 minutes, so. I noticed after I sang. 19 and 20, it really was 2019. I read it after I said it. I read it 3 times before I said it. I'm just once I read it, it's always. Sorry for the double 2019. Just so you know.
That's okay. Okay, hello. I'd like to welcome you all to the first event of the, I guess, new Village Square. So just to tell you a little bit about the history of the Village Square, this actually evolved from what was previously called the Summer Heat Political Science Series. It was hot topics in political science. So my colleague, who I'm about to introduce in a minute, Miranda Ashworth, who's on the panel, she and I sort of came up with the idea over the summer to just have a discussion about hot topics in political science. And then when the summer ended, the title really didn't go too well, but continuing into the fall, so it has now been renamed the Village Square. So today's event is Semi-Fascism. What does that even mean? So before I begin, I'd like to do a few introductions and thank yous. I'm Professor Heidi Green. I have been at Lone Star College for, this is my 17th year, and I teach political science. I would like to thank first and foremost the president, Dr. Valerie Jones, for being supportive of this endeavor throughout the summer and continuing into the fall. The VPI, Dr. Matthew Dempsey, our dean, Dr. Fay Lee, our division staff for Division 3, Nadia, Isaac, Sierra, and many others who helped get the refreshments you all are enjoying and helping with decorations and the scheduling of the event. I'd like to recognize Josh Estrada, who's sitting in the back, He has been with us from the very beginning and was our OTS person, and today he is serving as the online moderator. Campus police, who occasionally make an appearance at these events just to ensure our safety as we're discussing these topics. The government department, and I would like to recognize my fellow colleagues, Professor Daniel Cooper, Professor Milos Kaczarski, and Professor Mitch Kutzinger, who's hosting in the back and greeting you as you walked in. The history department, and I'd like to acknowledge Professor Keith Altavilla. I know I saw him. There you are, back there, for attending. He too has been with us from the very beginning, participating, and the speech department for joining us today. And in addition, college relations for promoting the event, the League of Women Voters, who they too have shown up to every event to register voters, and they are sitting outside. So those are the individuals I would like to thank. I do need to let you know that this event is being recorded, and so it will be recorded via Zoom for future use academically. So if you do not want to be on camera, although the camera will be facing the panelists, just sort of remaining in the back. The last thing is I would like to promote the introduction, promote the Introduction to Political Science course that is being offered in our department. Professor Ashworth is currently teaching that course, so if you are a student and you have any questions about it, you can speak to her at the end of today's presentation. We have also reactivated the Political Science Club. There is information on the back table, so at the end of today's event, if you are interested in participating and or being a member of the club, please feel free to take the information, and contact information is listed. There are International Education Week flyers, and they are also available at the table in the back. The panelists are kindly asking that when you enter, if you could record your attendance in today's event with the QR code sign in. There are a couple of sheets sort of floating around with the QR code. Mitch has those as well. And in the event that that doesn't work, at the end of the presentation, there is a form that you could actually sign if you can't do it via the QR code. So that now brings me to our three facilitators. So first, I would like to introduce Dr. Angela Bell. She is a professor of history and dual credit department chair at Lone Star College. Dr. Bell received a BS in secondary education with a special emphasis in social studies and English. She has a master's degree in history and a PhD in history from the University of Missouri. She is a religious historian with primary research interests in gender, race, genocide, and antebellum apocalyptic religion, with special emphasis on the 1838 Missouri Mormon conflict. Since 2014, she has participated in the Max A. Kaplan Institute for Educators at the Holocaust Museum in Houston, and was the 2019 Henia Leibman Fellow for the International Seminar in English at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, Israel. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Patrick Barton. He is a professor of communication studies who received 2 bachelor's degrees in film studies and communication studies from George Mason University, and a master's degree in communication studies from Kansas State University. He was a nationally ranked competitive public speaker for the George Mason University forensics team and a speech coach for the competitive speech teams at Kansas State University and Ohio University. He came to Lone Star College in 2010 and has since previously served as the Languages Department Chair, Faculty Senate President, and is currently the Faculty Fellow for the Teaching and Learning Center, which, by the way, I've been to some of those events and they are fantastic. He has a passion for attending and performing in live theater, discussing the latest movies, and dissecting the political rhetoric of the day. Finally, Finally, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Miranda Ashworth. She's been a government professor for 7 years and has been with us here at Lone Star College for 4 years. She is the current department chair of political science. She serves as the faculty advisor for the Political Science Club. She has a bachelor's in criminal justice with a concentration in Homeland Security, a master's in international relations with national security area of interest, which include extremism, terrorism, political violence, international law, and human rights. She has experience in security and emergency management planning and training at the federal, state, and county levels. She is passionate, and I know that, about encouraging civil discourse on politically charged topics. So I will now turn it over to the 3 panelists to present semi-fascism, and then after they are finished, it will be opened up for questioning and discussion.
Thanks, Heidi. Thank you all for attending. It's really nice to see all of you guys make the time to show up for this event. Just to give you guys kind of an overview of how we're going to approach this presentation, I'm going to give you guys some context of where we came up with this topic. Professor Barton is going to jump in and talk about communications a little bit, and then I'll give a little bit more context on how we use the term fascism in political science. And then Dr. Bell will give us some background on the historical context of fascism. So just to start off, I don't know how many of you guys are aware. Is this the clicker? That'll work. I don't know how many of you guys are aware of the fact that current President Joe Biden used the term semi-fascism in a rally recently. And the sentence that he said was, it's not just Trump, it's the entire philosophy that underpins the, and then paused and said, I'm just gonna say it, it's like semi-fascism. And I've had friends, colleagues, grandparents say, semi-fascism, what does that even mean? So it's kind of where I came up with the title for this particular event. So I just pulled a couple of quotes that were stated after this comment was made. So Joe Biden said, I respect conservative Republicans. I don't respect these MAGA Republicans. And then in a separate quote, he said, there are not many real Republicans anymore. And then in another quote, he said, the MAGA Republicans don't just threaten our personal rights and economic security. They are a threat to our very democracy. They refuse to accept the will of the people. They embrace political violence. They don't believe in democracy. So this was his justification for using the term fascism. We're going to talk a little bit more today about, was that the correct term to use? What were the intentions of using this particular term in mass communication? And just so that you guys know, various representatives from the Republicans called the president's comment about fascism despicable. So I'll turn the communications portion over to Professor Barton.
And actually, can you just go back to that? Sure, go back to that slide. So the top quote about semi-fascism and the next 2 quotes were actually not from a rally. Those were from a fundraiser. So he was at a Democrat fundraiser for the DNC at a private residence in Rockville, Maryland, when he said those. There's no recording of him saying those. There's no like audio or video recording, which is weird because usually people are recording those things. But the White House did release that on their official website as a transcript. So clearly they weren't trying to hide it. that was something they put out there. The next quote, the long one there, is actually from a rally later that day. So later that day, he went to a rally with like 3,000 people. And that's when he said that. This picture, which, does anybody recognize that? Has anybody seen that in the news, like this image or seen footage from this? So a few of you saw that. That's actually a wide shot. Most of it, if you watch most versions of it, it's actually a much narrower shot, and it's just a red background. So you can see there's like a blue and a red, but most of his speech is actually like just the red. And you can't see it really well, but there's 2 Marine guards in the background. Yeah. So if you were to go watch this speech, I watched it on a local. This is actually a speech 4 days later after he made those quotes. This is a speech 4 days later at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and in that he said a lot of similar things to that bottom quote there. It was about a 24-minute speech, but it was really focusing on him with the red and the guards in the background. And in fact, that caused some pundits to say things like, Tucker Carlson used the phrase bloody red Nazi lighting. The person filling in for Hannity that night said, this was a national primetime presidential address that you paid for in front of Independence Hall, but there was nothing presidential about this speech. It was a campaign event full of demeaning rhetoric backed with ominous red lighting. Brett Baer also, these are, for those who don't watch Fox News, these are Fox News folks, said, I too was struck by the image of the dark red lighting with the two Marines. A lot of times when we analyze things, we do it through the prism of how media recovered if Donald Trump gave the speech. I think they would not stop talking about it for weeks on end. Monica Crowley, who used to work in the Trump Treasury Department, said the imagery there was almost satanic with that red blood lighting and the two Marines behind them. So I guess the Marines are satanic, but whatever. I don't think that's what she meant. I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt. CNN also got in on it because CNN tries to be very balanced, I think, and they said, whatever you think of this speech, the military is supposed to be a political position. Marines in uniform behind President Biden for a political speech flies in the face of that. It's wrong when Democrats do it, it's wrong when Republicans do it. Another CNN is Jeff Slaney. He's the National Affairs correspondent, said, against a backdrop of two Marines sitting in tension in the Marine Band is a break with White House traditions. So that's kind of the media response to that speech, the one on the left with the red imagery in the background. The imagery in that really does reflect a lot of the use of MAGA Republicans. This is something that, from a communication perspective, that Biden has been doing a lot lately. He is trying to distinguish between mainstream old-fashioned Republicans and MAGA Republicans. And in his speech, the longer speech there, he actually uses a lot of very violent imagery. He talks about battle for the soul of the nation. He talks about how MAGA forces are determined to take this country backwards to an America where there is no right to choose, no right to privacy, no right to contraception, no right to marry who you love. So he's really trying to make it clear that it's a portion of the Republican Party. I think from a purely rhetorical perspective, it's hard to separate that out right now. I think a lot of people, are not going to go and I watched the speech 2 or 3 times. Most of you probably won't watch it one time. Most people are not going to go beyond a soundbite. And in fact, when I heard about the semi-fascism comment, and I was like, so I went out there to look for it. I was like, I want to hear him say it. I want to hear the context of what he said. And the fact that there was no recording of it, because I actually thought it was at this speech that he said that, but he didn't say it at that speech. And it's just this fact that we hold on to, we grab on narratives really quickly, I feel like, and we shape them however we want. If you're for Biden, you're like, yeah, those fascists, and we gotta be part of Antifa and things like that. And then obviously, if you're on the other side of things, you go, oh, I can't believe he's trying to divide America. Even in that speech, he even talked about having no red America, no blue America, but the United States of America, which is obviously echoing something President Obama said back in 2004, the Democratic National Convention. That was when he became really big. And the thing is as we become more polarized, things like this become more stark. And I'm not here to talk about the definition of fascism so much because that's not my expertise. But I will say that choosing the word semi-fascist and publishing it on the White House website, and then the next day he was asked as he was going to his helicopter, what did you mean by semi-fascism? And he's like, you know what I mean. That was his literal response. You know what I mean. And it feels divisive. And up until now, it feels like Joe Biden has tried to be more of a uniting force. And it really feels like he is getting a little more divisive now. And I get it, it's hard because if indeed MAGA Republicans are fascists, or semi-fascist, whatever that actually means, because that's a totally different, semi-meaning partially. Like, I feel like are you semi-pregnant? You're pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're fascist or you're not fascist. I feel like putting semi there doesn't quite make sense to me, but that's a later conversation, I think. It does put a really clear label on a very large group of Americans. Not all people who voted for Trump were necessarily MAGA Republicans, but a big chunk of them were MAGA Republicans. And so now are we labeling what, 25 20% of our entire population is fascists. That's a big deal for the president to say that, whether it was in a private conversation or not. And then 4 days later to go out and basically gave a political speech under the guise of giving a presidential address. And that also, if again, that one CNN commentator, if Trump did this, what would Democrats be saying? And I gotta believe that we were like, I can't believe you're using Marines and you're using Marines to spread a political message. And I really gotta think we gotta, you know, we gotta worry about like just taking one side just because you maybe vehemently disagree with the other side. We've gotta try to figure out how to come together. So that's my little bit. I don't know if that was too long or too short. It's a good.
Perfect, that's perfect. Thank you. So I actually really appreciate, Patrick, your take on this. I put together this slide from one particular news article that I felt was pretty reliable. And I have been so focused on this particular story. I was confident I heard him say semi-fascism. And then as I was looking for it, I couldn't find it either. And then as Patrick pointed out, these were from multiple speeches, and I was led to believe that everything that was said was in this particular speech. So I think that it is really important that we challenge ourselves with our media literacy. And I know that the library has a program that they've promoted. They use the SIFT method to determine the reliability of information that we're consuming. But I definitely think just pointing out the mass communication tactics and how that's used to manipulate public opinion is really important. But just because we know that they're manipulating public opinion doesn't mean we check out. It means that we get more curious and move into that. So thank you. We'll move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to point out a couple of things. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Brene Brown, but Brene Brown is a Houston native who has become famous for putting language to emotions. And one of the things that I think is really cool about her work is she points out how important using the correct terminology is. And so one, like a really good example is you may be having a conversation with somebody who you have a relationship and you say, I'm angry. When what you mean is I'm disappointed. And those things are very different. And if you can't identify those two different emotions, then it's really hard for the relationship to move forward and seeking a resolution, right? Same thing whenever we're having conversations around political science. If we aren't using the terms correctly, there's a good chance we're talking about different things. And so that's why I really emphasize making sure we're using these terms correctly. So I wanted to draw a distinction between political attitudes and political ideologies. So just a quick introduction on political attitudes. Political attitudes are views regarding the necessary pace and scope of the change and the balance between freedom and equality. So essentially what this is saying is your attitude, your political attitude is how fast do you think change should take place? And should you be working within the institutions that exist? Or do you want to destroy the institutions that exist? Do you want to create new institutions? So like revolution or voting for change would be good examples. I noticed that I have a typo that last radicals is supposed to be reactionaries, but the major categories when we're talking about political attitudes would be radicals, liberals, conservatives, and reactionaries. Radicals prefer large institutional change, so they don't want to destroy the system, but they want lots of change. Liberals prefer change within the existing institutions, so they want change, and they don't really want the institutions to change too much. Conservatives tend to be skeptical of change and they want to retain the status quo, so they also want to keep the institutions. And reactionaries seek to restore political, social, and economic institutions, real or imaginary. So that maybe we want to return to a way we previously did it, or we wanted to return to a way that we have said we previously did it, but may not be entirely true. You can go to the next slide, please. So this gives you a view of looking at attitudes on a continuum. So radicals are extreme liberals and reactionaries are extreme conservatives. So that kind of gives you the look at when we say somebody leans left or somebody leans right. These are the correct terms to use. If you are just left of center, you would be a liberal. If you are very left of center, you would be radical. And then if you're just right of center, you would be a conservative. And if you are far to the extreme on the right end, you would be a reactionary. So this helps to explain why in the United States, liberal sometimes means left wing, but liberal is always going to be the left side of the spectrum of do you want to keep the institution and how much change do you want or not want. Go to the next slide, please. Moving into ideologies, this is where the term fascism comes in for political science. So political ideology is where the basic values held by an individual about the fundamental goals of politics or the ideal balance of freedom and equality. So in any given society, when we're talking about what kinds of government do we want to run our society, all individuals have inclinations towards, do we need to have more government, meaning more institutions that help to maintain order and control, or do we want to rely on individuals to basically regulate themselves, right? So we're always talking about the balance between individual freedom and equality, okay? So liberalism would be an emphasis on individual freedom. Communism would be an emphasis on economic equality. Social democracy and socialism is a balance between the two. And fascism would be an advancement of a superior group or race. And then anarchism would be the elimination of state power. So on the next slide, I have a graphic that kind of breaks this down that helps to give a better idea of what exactly we're talking about here. So in the middle, you have your freedom index. So this would be at the top, high freedom. At the bottom would be low freedom. To the left would be absolute equality. And to the right would be low equality. So you'll see if you have high equality and high freedom, that would be anarchism. If you have high freedom and low equality, that would be liberalism, which is what the US identifies as. If you have high equality and low freedom, that would be communism. And if you have low equality and low freedom, that would be fascism. And social democracy fits right in the middle, where it is a balance of freedom and equality. So that is how we talk about fascism in political science. I also circulated a handout. If you didn't get one, I'm sure Mitch can run over and give you one. But these are the 14 early warning signs of fascism, and we can go over these after Dr. Bell has a chance to give us some historical context. But I do think it's important to note that we do have patterns that have been identified throughout history where we can help to identify what is a fascist movement. And that's part of the goal of political science. Political scientists aren't historians, that's not our lane. We look at history and try to identify patterns to predict and prescribe what is going to come next based on historical accounts. And so that's what this sheet helps us to identify. This is actually a small version of what was a poster that was being sold at the US Holocaust Museum. And I read it by Dr. Bell, and she agrees that this is pretty accurate in terms of identifying signs of fascism. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Josh is going to pull up a web page for us. As I was preparing for this, I was going to make a PowerPoint, and then I realized that it's already been done. And so I decided not to reinvent the wheel and use one that is well-researched and very well done. That's okay, no problem. I will say, as he's pulling it up, one of the things that is important to understand about history is the historical memory. You were saying you were convinced that you had heard him say this in the speech. Imagine that we are convinced that something has happened, and we are convinced for generations, 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 and generations. And so this idea becomes lodged in our collective memory. When it may or may not have really happened. So there's, when people talk about things like, this is my heritage, or this is my history, and historians are going, no, it's not, because none of that actually happened. That's the kind of thing that we're constantly working to counteract as we look at history. Also, I would argue there is a fundamental kind of misunderstanding of what history is. By a lot of people. There are a lot of people like, I know a lot about history, I know all these things. And history is not trivial. History is an example of how you get from point A to point B. Here is point A, here is point B, here is how we got from here to here. And that's what history is. It's a story, it's a narrative of how we moved from this event and this time and this way of thinking to this place and this time and this way of thinking. So because of that, it's interesting to try to define history, or to define fascism in an event that the subtitle is, what is that anyway? As I looked at many definitions, this is not quite the definition I use when I teach it in my classes, but it's pretty close. So at the top of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum webpage, they have a very robust, I will use the word robust, I use that very rarely, a very robust education department that is staffed by very qualified and highly skilled and highly respected historians. So it's not just, you know, they Googled something and stuck it on the website. These are scholars that specialize in this, who are writing these things and creating the displays at the museum. So, and they have a pretty solid education department too, where they're constantly bringing educators in and teaching these things and how do we teach this to our students. So the definition of fascism is that fascism is a far-right political philosophy or theory of government that emerged in the early 20th century. It prioritizes the nation over the individual who exists to serve the nation. While fascist movements can be found in almost every country following World War I, fascism was most successful in Italy and Germany. And I would argue that most of us, especially those of us who are not necessarily well-versed in fascism as a, you know, something that we're, you know, we don't sit around and talk about it all the time, or at least not talk about it correctly. We usually will associate fascism with Nazism. And that's not necessarily the case. The Nazis were fascists, but all fascists were not Nazis. And so you mentioned on your slide that fascism looks at the eradication of an inferior group of people. I would say in history, we look at it as it's a system that is a nationalist system. The way to get that nationalism is to remove unwelcome elements. So that makes sense a lot. But if you're looking at the fascist organizations or fascist governments in the 1900s, Italy is the first one under Mussolini. And 1919 is when the fascist party won power in, or it's when the fascist party was organized under Mussolini. He won power in the early 20s. It's 21, I could be wrong. Hitler, who was also a member of the fascist party in Germany, he attempts to emulate the same type of event that brought Mussolini to power. Mussolini had this march on Rome, where these people were kind of marching and taking over the government. And Hitler tries to do the same thing in the early 1920s. He is arrested and he is put in jail. That's in 1923. And so it does not happen in Germany until 1933. So it's an entire decade before Hitler is able to, the Nazi party is able to take power in Germany, and then that Hitler rises to power with him there. He's pretty much in power, but by the time he becomes the dictator of Germany. So if you look at, one of the things that I think is important to understand when we look at the history of fascism is that there are a lot of people who, I really appreciated your spectrum because I look at that too. And one of the things that has happened over and over in the US, when I hear people talking, is there is this kind of conflation of terms. Communism, socialism are the same thing to a lot of people. They are not, otherwise they wouldn't have two definitions and two different names. And there is also a conflation between people of what fascism and communism is. My grandmother, who was 95 and lived through World War II, is convinced that fascism and communism are the same thing. And I was like, no, they are not. And she's like, I lived through it. And I was like, yes, you did. You're wrong. Historical memory. She is positive that we fought against the Soviets in World War II. And I was like, no, we did not. We were on the same side. It's a long story. She's 95. Bless her heart. Okay, so anyway, sorry if you're new to this. So one of the things I think is really important to understand is that fascism is by definition a right-wing system. Communism is not. Communism and fascism do not like each other. Stalin and Hitler hated each other. And so it is important to understand that as we're looking back. So if you look at number 3 over here on this page, it says fascism is a far right-wing theory of government that opposes the political philosophies of the Enlightenment and the 19th century, including democratic liberalism, communism, and socialism. It is part of the definition of what fascism is, to not like the things that people are saying it is like. And so there's, I think it's important to understand that distinction. And if you scroll down just a little bit, there's a couple of bullet point lists. There's one of them, thank you. So fascism, these are kind of the highlights of what fascism is. Striding off an exclusionary nationalism, Some of these things, the reason I'm pointing these bullet points out is because there are echoes of these things that are happening today. As a historian, it's very frustrating to me when people say that history repeats itself. It does not. There are things that are familiar that tend to come up over and over, but it's not the same thing every time. And so there is starting off an exclusionary nationalism and fascism. That is not the same thing necessarily as nationalism today in this country. There is a fixation with national decline and threats to the existence of the national community. There is an enemy that is out to get us. In Nazi Germany, that was the Jews. It also happened to be a bunch of other people. The Nazis did not like communists. They did not like socialists. They did not like people who were part of what we would call the LGBT community today. They did not like people who were physically or mentally disabled, and exterminated all of those groups of people and imprisoned all of those groups of people. So there is a perceived threat that is coming to get us, whether or not that's real or not. And there is the embrace of paramilitarism. So there are echoes of many of these things that I think people are talking about with regard to what's happening in this country today. They are not the same things exactly, but there are echoes of it. And then if you scroll down one more section, there we go. Fascism defines the national will, which is, remember that in fascism, for historians, we are looking at kind of this extreme nationalism. It's this emphasis on the state, and that individuals are supposed to work for the state to make it better and go us kind of thing. So the perception of, sorry, let me rephrase my thought here. Fascism is defining national will. I'll just read it because it's better than what I can say. Fascism defines the national will as advancing the interests of the national community, and that means these four things. We are going to elevate the national community above the rights of those that are elsewhere. You may have heard America First multiple times. That is an echo of that. Removing obstacles to national unity and suppression, those seen as challenging it. I will not even bother to comment on that. I think that's pretty obvious. Expanding the size and the influence of the national state. This, I think, is really fascinating because in general, when I think about the Republican Party, I tend to think of less government. That's not necessarily the case in this, in number 3 here. And we're often seeking to expand territory through armed conflict. To my knowledge, I do not know that we are invading other countries and taking over so much. Maybe there's imperialism going on, but not necessarily this group of people. So I hope that gives some sort of kind of national or historical context of where fascism fits in our system.
Thank you, appreciate that. I wanted to just briefly go over the 14 points and then we'll open it up for discussion. There are a couple points that I wanted to make sure you guys understood the distinctions of, and I added the term ultranationalism at the bottom of the page with asterisks that wasn't included in the original poster. I was curious, what do you think the difference between fascism and ultranationalism is?
Fascism is, for the most part, it's both a type of government, but it's also like a time, happens during a specific time period. You said an article that a scholar talks about this, and it's really well put, which is fascism is a response to things that are happening in the early 19th century, or the early 20th century, in particular, the response to World War I. And so those same events are not necessarily happening now. So fascism is a specific reaction to those things, while ultranationalism could come from many other causes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's something I wanted to point out is a lot of people who have criticized, a lot of scholars who have criticized the fascist movement is not taking place in the United States, argue it's not fascism, it's ultranationalism. And so just drawing the distinction between those two, but that brings me to the first point, powerful and continuing nationalism. So the explanation is fascist regimes tend to make constant use of patriotic mottos, slogans, symbols, songs, and other paraphernalia. Flags are seen everywhere, as are flag symbols on clothing and in public displays. I just wanted to make sure that we understand the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Nationalism can be promotion of I lived in Alabama for a while, so I heard a lot of times like Bama Nation or Auburn Nation. They're talking about a group of people that share common beliefs, common goals. In political science, we're talking about political goals, right? But you can be a nation without actually representing the entire country, right? So you can be advocating for your goals and your group's advancement without representing everybody that lives within the territory that's defined as a country. When you're patriotic, you can be patriotic and disagree with the government. So for example, you can choose not to stand for the national anthem because you're advocating that the country hasn't lived up to the ideals of equal treatment under the law, and that would be considered patriotic by definition. So that's just kind of a difference between patriotism and nationalism that I wanted to point out. On the disdain for the recognition of human rights, one thing that I think would be worth considering, specifically referring to summary executions, assassinations, and long incarceration of prisoners. What we should be asking ourselves in the United States, specifically when it comes to human rights on this issue, is are we respecting criminal due process rights? So the idea that people are innocent until proven guilty and that we actually abide by the justice system and we're not rushing to violate those human rights. Jumping down to controlled mass media, I think something else that would be really worth considering is the vilification of the media right now. I don't know if Professor Barton, if you would agree with that assessment.
Going Patrick, it's
Okay.
it's going Patrick.
I keep going back. Would you agree that vilification of the media would be controlling mass media?
Well, I think there's actually two elements of controlling mass media. One is the vilification, the fake news. Anything you don't agree with is fake news, but at the same time, the number one news network in the United States is, anybody? Fox. And that's because there's no liberal version of Fox News. You can say MSNBC, but it doesn't have nearly the viewing power of Fox. So when Fox says something, so that's, I mean, it's almost the fact that our former president would call into Fox regularly and almost make policy decisions on the air. It just shows that that's almost like a national media, which is like what Russia has, right? A national media. Technically there's no official national media, but that's what I think that refers to is creating a nationally controlled media. Does that kind of disagree with that?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
A couple others I wanted to touch on, religion and government are intertwined. There may be some examples that come to mind for you guys right now, but really anytime, like we are a secular state, we may have history rooted in religious foundations, but we are established as a secular state, meaning that we don't have government or religion making decisions for how people are going to be governed, right? That should never be a justification in the United States. We should be making arguments about the balance between freedom and security, and also really emphasizing the inalienable rights that are established in the Bill of Rights. But the decisions that are made by our government should not be backed by any particular religious doctrine that is not in alignment with a liberal democracy. Corporate power is protected. So leaders, often are the ones who put the government leaders into power, creating a mutually beneficial business and government relationship and power elite. We can discuss if you guys think that that is taking place. Let's see, obsession with crime and punishment. There's often a national police force with virtually unlimited power in fascist nations, specifically that are foregoing civil liberties in the name of patriotism. A couple of things that come to mind with that would be some of the social justice reckoning that we saw through 2020 and some of the responses to that. But we can discuss whether or not you guys think that that is an indicator of fascism. And then the last one I just wanted to touch on was the fraudulent elections. So there are a lot of different ways to undermine democracy. There are plenty of countries that are not actually classified, or like we wouldn't as scholars consider them to be democracies that claim that they are. And you can undermine democracy, you can undermine elections in a lot of ways. You can completely rig them, you can get false results. You can only allow one party to run. You can have intimidation at the polls. You can claim that the results were not fair, they were made up. You can try to intervene in the certification of an election. All of those things would fall under this classification of fraudulent elections. So I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of background on that. And if you guys are good with it, we can open it up for discussion and questions, or you can.
Can I just ask a question about political alignment? Populism, what's populism in the spectrum of all of this?
So populism is essentially, it can come from either side of the ideological spectrum. You can have liberal populists or you can have conservative populists. But essentially what they're doing is they're appealing to the masses, saying, you have been wronged and we need to turn against those people who have wronged you. We have populists who appeal to the economic side of things. So the masses who may be poor need to rebel against those who are rich. We can appeal to the cultural populists based on religion or ethnicity. And then we also hear people making elitist populist appeals. So saying that it's those elites that are running the government and we need to drain the swamp. That would be a populist appeal.
So there's a lot of overlap. There can be a lot of overlap between ultranationalism and populism then?
Ultranationalism would make populism more successful.
Okay. I just like to learn things too.
So you just got your question first. I see.
Thank you, yes.
So do you guys have any comments or questions, or I'd be happy to open it up to what do you guys think? Are we seeing the fascist movement? Yes.
So this is just more of a perception, and I'm curious, Angela, dealing with the history of fascism, how often was assimilation part of fascism? Because it feels like there's a little bit of that going on right now because of the I hate to use this phrase, the color of the group that seems to be a little more radical. It's very much, it's not the same. It's very varied, and it feels like there's an assimilation happening. And I'm curious, was that ever a big thing with fascism in the past?
Kind of.
What is assimilation?
Assimilation, for those of you who don't know, assimilation is the process of making a group that is less similar to the dominant strain of the dominant group, more like the dominant group. So for instance, in this country, when we have at the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, we have these massive waves of immigrants coming into this country, something like millions and millions of people a year. We attempt to get them to have less of their own culture and more of our culture. So speaking English, getting rid of, in that case, Catholicism or Judaism. There's a lot of Eastern European Jews coming in the post-1890. Also things like dressing American, we do this with the Native Americans, force them to dress in Western clothing, put them in schools to teach them American history, not speaking their languages, that kind of thing. So I'll use Germany as an example, because Nazi Germany as an example, because that's the one we're most familiar with. One of the things that is really kind of fascinating in a horrifying way about Nazi Germany is that it didn't matter how German you were if you happened to be a member of this group. So there were a lot of German Jews who did not consider themselves Jewish. They did not practice Judaism. They fully believed they were German, and it didn't matter. So it didn't matter how much assimilation was happening, that it just wasn't, it didn't matter. They were there. If you were, I think the definition, I'd have to go back and look, but I think the definition was if you have one of your 8 grandparents is Jewish, then you are Jewish. And so it's very similar to the 1-drop rule with African Americans. If there's any African American blood in your history, then you are Black. So I think it's different. What's happening now is very different. It's more of an ideological assimilation, which is not at all what was going on in Nazi Germany as far as the groups who were targeted. Now, those who, there's a kind of constant argument in genocide and Holocaust studies about whether or not Germans were Germans or Germans were Nazis. And for the most part, historians of genocide and the Holocaust, and especially of World War II, argue that if you were German, you were Nazi. It did not matter if you believed in it or not, you were a Nazi by definition, because that's what the government was at the time. Now, there are people who resisted and people who did things like hid political prisoners and Jewish people and rebelled against the Nazi government, but they were usually killed. They were eliminated. So it's an interesting kind of conversation because we're hearing that same, I was hearing, I'm sure most of you were too, hearing that same thing after the 2016 election. Well, if you know somebody who voted for this person, then therefore you should cut them out of your lives. And I was like, I'm not going to cut my dad out of my life, right? And so I'll just argue with him and then it'll be fun. Family gatherings are fun. So not the same way is the answer to your question. I can elaborate it, but hopefully that answers your question.
And also, not even necessarily arguing, but having conversations with people with different opinions is what helps keep democracy strong. We have to engage in conversations where we disagree, because if we aren't engaging in those conversations, we can't find middle ground, and democracy doesn't exist anymore. So glad you didn't cut your down.
Thank you. I think he's okay with it too. Go ahead.
Thank you for doing this, Miranda Ashworth. That was good. I have a question, but I want to put back forth an argument first. That is this semi-fascist? So, as you said, Biden had left it open, and so there was a lot of commentary like in the Washington Post. So if we're going to do a recipe, and by the way, my daughter tested positive for pregnancy, but then they told her she wasn't. So you can. They told her chemical. It's like life, it's really great, even in pregnancy tests. So anyway, fascism, divine, messianic, charismatic, good lives, that's Trump. Trump, the 2020 platform for the Republican Party, they said Trump. So those are the four for that recipe. A lot of propaganda, incredible. I mean, Trump told over 20,000 lies documented by people. Incredible amount. Xenophobia, immigrants are existential threat. Yeah, that's definitely it. The border, we're voting, border. And now in the county, what do we vote on? Police, violent crime. It's a big thing. If we don't have enough police, they want to hire 1,000 police. So yeah, semi-fascist there. But here's my question. Number 7 on the list is fear. And I would agree, fear is an incredible motivator. You gotta have fear. And that's what Ken Burns showed in the 6-hour special. He showed Mussolini and Hitler coming to power versus Roosevelt. And there was a lot of temptation for Roosevelt to become like Mussolini and Hitler, in fact. But it could have happened. He could have taken power because of how bad the Great Depression was. So fear, but I would also argue on your list that you have to have hate. So there's kind of implied that there's people you don't like, like intellectuals or like, but you gotta hate. And so I would ask you, fear and hate, the most important part of fascism. And I reference you to the movie Get Me Roger Stone. Incredible amount of hate, and that's how you got people to vote against Hillary. Hillary hate is incredible. And then also the movie Jojo Rabbit, where they didn't hate. So my question: fear and hate, critical fascism.
The first thing I would like to address, you used a lot of terms and used a lot of them correctly, and I appreciate throwing out all the xenophobia and talking about the border and how that's trying to trigger emotional responses. And that's where we can, as a society, kind of elevate the conversation and be more specific of, if we're talking about the border, that is part of the government's function. That is part of their role, is to ensure national security, literally in the definition. But if we're being motivated to make decisions on how we go about securing the border based on emotional responses rather than empirical data, that's probably an indicator that we're not being driven by the right motives, right? And a lot of our political actors right now on both sides are saying things that are emotionally triggering because people don't make decisions that are always best in their policy interests. When they're driven by emotional fear, they do it out of fear of the other or the out group. And so I think pointing that out, the fear and the hate, I think is a really interesting perspective. I'm interested in what you think. Fear and hate, they have to go together.
I don't think they have to go together. I think that they are often cultivated together. I'm a historian, so I'm going to refer historically to what's going on or what happened. But there was a very concerted propaganda push against the Jewish people in Germany for years. And one of the most famous propaganda tools was a children's book that was called The Poison Mushroom. And it's actually on display at the Holocaust Museum here in Houston. They have a copy of it, and it was basically this idea that the Jewish people were a poison to society, and that they could at any point be ingested and kill us all, kind of thing. Ingested as in eat the mushroom, not like snorting people. So anyway, there is a concerted effort to do that historically, and that has happened in many contexts. So I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I had a brilliant idea and it went away, but it was going to be brilliant.
Well, one of the things I was thinking, and kind of, I think even more back to your point, is I don't think, like you said, that fear and hate have to go together in terms of for fascism to exist, but they do drive one another. And I think one of the biggest things in terms of fear is like, you can be fearful that we're going to experience a recession. That's something that triggers fear, but there's a different level of fear when you're triggering existential threats, right? Like if we don't stop this, the poison mushroom, you will die. You will not have a country anymore. Like that kind of stuff, those appeals to fear where it's to the level of existential threat. I think that's kind of what you're seeing the underlining tones in these points are of like, you need to fear the other, otherwise your future is at, like your livelihood is at risk.
If I can add on to that, so great points, and I agree. I actually think fear and hate are tied into willingly giving an authoritarian power, because there can be authoritarians on both a liberal side and a fascist side, right? And you know, in a way, you know, some of the rhetoric our president right now is using is fearful language. If we don't do this, we risk losing all of our freedoms. And I think, unfortunately, and I don't think, by the way, President Biden comes from a place of hate, but I know, unfortunately, some of my friends do go to a place of hate when you do that. Oh, I hate those MAGA Republicans. I hate what they're doing. And I think it's just as impossible to create hatred and fear as a link on a liberal side as it is on a more conservative side. And that's what I worry about the most is, you know, and I get the feeling of Antifa, like I want to go punch a Nazi today. And I get that feeling, I understand that, but I'm also a communicator. Like we must try to solve problems with communication and not with violence. And that's what I fear is going to this other side of authoritarianism. And not that we're going there, I don't think President Biden's going to bring us there, but that is perhaps what a MAGA Republican / fascist, whatever we're going to call them, is going to be afraid of. And so now we've created more division. So that's kind of where that's what I'm afraid of more than anything is creating more divide. And that's where I think these labels are potentially really damaging, because we all know one of these MAGA Republicans and maybe have them in our families. And as a result, are we ready to call you're a fascist? And you know, because you lived in Germany, you're a fascist. Because you're this, you're like, ooh, I think there's a lot of people who voted for President Trump that were afraid and fearful, and maybe even had, but I bet a lot of them had no hate in their hearts. I bet they were just afraid. And former President Trump was able to get them more afraid than President Biden was. And I think that's what a lot of politics is about, at least today. It didn't used to be this way. We did not always used to be based on fear. And I think that's where that hatred fear connection I think is really interesting, but it worries me a lot. It really does.
It's a good question. Thank you.
Questions for you, Kristen?
I think we're okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Earlier you mentioned Fox News kind of becoming sort of like this national network with Trump down. Could you dive deeper into what are the dangers there, and if there are some inherent dangers, like what the other side can do, like combat fascism, like should they point out the flaws and having such a huge network just dedicated to the right, or should they like try to campaign to break that up? What would be a good way to do that if there's
Can I just say one piece real quick, and then I'd like to read an answer, but I think that it's important to note that this profit-driven media is not normal. The way that our country was established, the media was supposed to serve as a watchdog, as a servant to the people. And so we don't really want our elected officials and our media outlets to be closely tied. We want them to serve as a watchdog so that they can report back to the people, so the people can make informed decisions, and that's what helps democracy. And so that's my first thing that I see as a problem with having any president kind of running the narrative of any news outlet. But I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, I think that this is such a new phenomenon, right? This is really, really new. Even just the idea of 24-hour news. There are people in this room right now that remember before a time of 24-hour news. I remember a time before 24-hour news where we got an hour of news a day, like 30 minutes of the national and 30 minutes of local at night, 5, 6 o'clock, sitting around the dinner table, let's watch the news. And that was it. Maybe you got late night, like Nightline, or you had the morning news was fluff, let's be honest, still kind of fluff. But there was no cycle, and I think when CNN was born in the early 80s, right, mid-80s, anybody remember? Somewhere around there. And it was not on everybody's channel at the time because not everybody had cable, for some of the young people out there, you're like, what? What do you mean? There were literally 4 channels if you count PBS. And that was it. That was before Fox, everything. There was none of this. So with the advent of 24-hour news, things went haywire and they had to fill up with more and more and more. And by doing that, they went away from news, actually. I'd say, I don't watch the 24-hour news networks anymore, but I believe way more than 50% is not news at all. It's commentary, it's panel discussions like this, not news. And I'm guessing maybe 3 or 4 hours a day out of 24 hours is actual news. And that's CNN, that's Fox, that's MSNBC. But the problem is when you put the word news on it, people tune in, they go, oh, this is the news. They watch Hannity or they watch Rachel Maddow and they go, this is the news. Neither of them are newscasters. Both of them are commentators, but we're treating it as news. And then when you have the president, the former president who did this, I don't think Biden does this very much, calling in on a regular basis and making news along the way, that's when things went haywire. Part of this because he was a reality show guy. He was literally a reality show star. So what's he gonna do? He's gonna use the media in a way that's never been used before, and a way that other than maybe Ronald Reagan, who was an actor. But besides that, no other politician can really do what President Trump did. And I think, so I don't know if it's that bad, but the fact that there's one station that has that much power, I think is problematic. We can't do anything about it. I don't want to dismantle the First Amendment.
Well, sorry to interrupt you. There actually, there was the Communications Act of 1934 that used to require that what was reported was backed up, and if it wasn't backed up, then they had to run retractions, basically. And it wasn't until we started really prophetizing the media that we saw this shift. And you're right, with the 24-hour news cycle, we have way more subjective information than we have objective information. So that's one of the things that I challenge my students and anybody that will listen to me is like, when you're watching the news, challenge yourself. Is that subjective or is it objective? And a really good way to answer that question is like, if unfortunately we hear all the time about a mass shooting taking place. If a mass shooting took place and CNN says a mass shooting took place and Fox says a mass shooting took place, that is objectively true. It happened, right? And then all the other, what we need to do about it, and what we should be fearful of, that's subjective, that's not news. And so there's actually a really good book by Robert Reich called The System, Who Broke It and How to Fix It. And he gives recommendations on how to restore the truth. And a lot of that goes back to holding media officials accountable. And it's going to take a lot of work by the public and by our lawmakers, but it is possible. And so I just don't want to write it off of like, 24-hour news and we're just up a creek without a paddle, because we've done it differently before and we can adjust to this technological evolution of our news, but it's going to take some work. And I think holding our news outlets accountable of separating objective and subjective messages would be a good start. And then also making sure that they're held accountable by maybe independent watchdogs that will say what you reported is untrue. You have to retract that, or go out and say that it was untrue, or you'll be fined by the government or something like that.
And just so you know, the reason that that act is no longer in place is because it was, I can't remember if it was overturned or if there was a new law written to replace it or if it was retracted. So that was done during the 1980s under Donald. We can see the 24-hour news cycle, which started early in the 80s, has benefited from that. We have a question there and a question there.
So when y'all are talking about like, we're talking about conservative thought, exploiting media and using media, you all not think the liberal relations, or when it comes to maybe they're not using CNN, but they're using more social media, TikTok, Instagram, and multiple other sources like Twitter. Well, and also where it comes to like silencing people in terms of sometimes canceling them for saying things that we not match others.
Well, I'll say they're not doing it as effectively. The fact that there is no one standard to go to for liberal news like there is for conservative news. There's been a couple, like Crooked Media is an example of one company that's trying to do that on the podcast scale. There are a bunch of former Obama staffers who got together and made a whole company with a bunch of podcasts that are very liberal in nature. But they don't even come close to competing with what Rush Limbaugh used to do when he was alive, or what I think all of the Fox people have a radio show too. Like their numbers are just outrageously higher than anything any liberal does. As far as the canceling, by the way, you have several different questions there. The cancellation thing is problematic, and I agree that there is a problem with some what's it called when they're extremely liberal? Reaction? No, it's not. It's radicals. There are definitely some radical liberalism happening here, or radical liberals who are creating problems with our freedom of speech. Because if you say a certain thing and you offend people, and you don't do the right things right afterwards, you do run the risk of losing your livelihood, or of maybe being fired, depending on where you work, right? But as we learned in my class, my First Amendment doesn't mean you get the freedom of speech to say whatever you want without consequence. It just means the government can't hurt you. So there are consequences for your speech, but I do feel like sometimes it goes a little too far on the radical side of things, because, you know, if we say something that's wrong, we should give them the chance to learn from it and try to figure out how to do it better, but not immediately go, oh, we've got to, this person can't be at work here anymore. This is not what we represent. I'm the white dude here. I probably shouldn't be.
I think the ideas that come to mind to draw the distinction of what you said between how Republicans and liberals are using the media is liberals appeal to and want to have their messages reported. They're using social media, things like that. I think what's been described on the conservative side with Fox News is like we've seen like this melting together where it's kind of hard to see like where the media stops and where that party or administration ends. And that's where I think that becomes problematic with fascism. And as far as the cancel culture, I think that you addressed that very well. One thing that I just kind of like to throw out to my students is identifying like what exactly do we expect when somebody has screwed up, and essentially what we want is accountability, right? And if it's a big screw up and it's a continual screw up and there's no accountability, maybe canceling is justifiable. But if it's something that happened in the 80s, it happened one time, there was an acknowledgement of it, I will change, and like their history has demonstrated they did, maybe like ruining their life probably is acceptable at that point. Like accountability, like a punishment that fits the crime, essentially is what we should be advocating for as a society. And I think that will help with the freedom of speech, is having reasonable expectations of accountability rather than just like, you're not woke enough or politically correct, so get out, right?
And there's also a difference between what the news is and what media is. And I think that's being conflated in a lot of ways. A lot of people assume that anything that is media is news, and that's just not true. So if you are aware of what is media and what media does, then you understand that that's different than here are the facts of what has happened. Then that's something that needs to be. I would argue more people need to be able to do that, and hopefully that's what we're teaching our classes. But that is, I would argue, not what the general population is doing. There's a conflation of the two.
So for people my age who sometimes fail to differentiate opinions in media, how do you raise awareness to make sure that people
I'm just like focusing on this one politician, or this one speaker, this one like role model in society, where people are just focusing on them and their ideals and not looking at all options and then making sure that like in the middle, where it's like reasonable between liberal and conservative or any other views.
It's a good question. One thing that Melanie Steele did our last event for the book bans, and I think what her answer was the most concise and the most helpful, was if you find a topic that you're interested in, whether it makes you happy or enraged, look for evidence. Concrete evidence is what helps you determine like what is a subjective opinion and what's objectively true is identifying evidence. Thanks for your question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear your opinions. 50, 60 years ago, you turn on the news, you had CBS, NBC, ABC, you know, maybe a couple of other sources that, you know, you had to choose. Nowadays, where you have media that's driven by algorithms online, you know, it's so easy to go down a rabbit hole of any particular philosophy. You go down a left-wing rabbit hole, you go down a right-wing rabbit hole. You know, how do we get out of this? I mean,
Don't cut your dad out of your life.
yeah.
Totally get
There's so much easy reinforcement of a particular point of view, rather than challenging people with alternate points of view. The more you look at one thing, you're going to be repeatedly shown it. I mean, if I look at an advertisement, I end up seeing multiple advertisements for the same thing.
And that's why we have to be active and responsible consumers of information.
Yeah.
Because if we rely on the algorithms, we know, I mean, TikTok, I think is the worst, and I think YouTube's right behind it as far as creating what we would call an echo chambers, where you just keep hearing the same opinion back. And I think TikTok has mastered that. If you've ventured down any political TikToks, like you're only getting more and more extreme stuff on that. On that end of the spectrum. And so you have to actively seek to engage with other people. And that's essentially why we created the Village Squares, so that we could hear each other talk and hear that, hey, I don't completely agree, but I am concerned. Let's talk about it, because the way that we're consuming our media right now just really isn't working. And it's only making things worse whenever we think, you know, if you did cut your dad out of your life and you're only surrounded with people who hate those MAGA Republicans, it's easy to believe nobody else would support that crazy candidate that you don't like, right? And that's super dangerous too. And so that's why engaging in civil discourse. And then as far as the way that you consume your media, the way that I do it, and I don't know that everybody else has time to do this because this is part of my job, but I start out with one news organization, watch about 10 minutes, and then switch over. And if there's something that I feel emotionally triggered by, one of the first things I ask myself is, does somebody benefit from me being angry about this? Because that's essentially what they're trying to do, is make money and cause you to react. And then if there's something that sticks with me, I dig deeper and look for concrete evidence to support what was said. But it's hard. We're infiltrated with lots of information, and a lot of information that's not very good.
There's also, in history, we hear this all the time, well, that's so biased. That's one of my most irritating sentences in the world. Everything has bias because humans have biases. So I had a friend who asked me during the Arab Spring back a few years ago, she was asking me kind of what's the short version of what's going on, because she doesn't watch the news. And I said, you know, perhaps you should start watching the news. And so she said, well, what should I look at? And I said, well, here are the different networks. Here are what they're affiliated with. So, you know, if you're listening to the news, for instance, I watch NBC most of the time. They always say, if there's a story about something, they're like, it happens to be a parent company of our network. So you know that if they're doing a story on light bulbs, then that is a company that is associated or affiliated with that company. And so when you're listening to the news and you're paying attention, they're going to out their biases as they're giving it to you. And so I think that's something to be aware of. Most people just kind of don't listen to that kind of thing, but they will tell you ABC owns Disney and ESPN and Hulu. Like, you know that those companies are connected. CNN is Turner, right? I mean, we have these connections. So if you're aware of those, that helps as well.
There's also a website that I reference a lot and send my students to. It's called All Sides Now, and they do bias reports and show like an overall graph of where each one of these news outlets falls on the graph. And so I think that that's helpful. There are some news outlets that I really like that lean one direction, largely because of the amount of subjective information that's there, but I try to balance with one that's kind of equally situated from the center to at least hear both perspectives, but it's an active decision that you have to make.
Yeah, the Columbia School of Journalism publishes a list called Who Owns What. And you can trace all the connections. Like
Very helpful. Something I want to point out about the area you're talking about, when there were 3 networks plus PBS, like they all reported the same thing. You just had Dan Rather, or you had Peter Jennings, or you had whoever, right? You had the different guys in the 80s, right? But they all said the exact same. You could switch channels, and maybe the order is different, and that's an editorial choice. But you didn't get different news. But you can pick. You can turn on 3 different stations, and they cover the exact same story, and it's going to be entirely different. And that's the most scary thing I think about media today, is that, you know, it brings this, you know, at the very beginning of the Trump presidency, you know, Kellyanne Conway, which is one of his fighters, came out and said, you know, there were 1 million people at the inauguration. You know, these are alternative facts. As if that's a thing, like facts are facts are facts. Like the fact is that no, there's a certain number of people, but now we've turned this thing like there's different versions, and that is where we do need these multiple sources. You cannot rely on one news source. You do need to do more, and going down those rabbit holes, you just gotta stay off YouTube, stay off TikTok. I'm not on TikTok, thank goodness.
I'm telling you, most of my students say they get their news from YouTube or TikTok. Yeah. Somebody have a question? Go ahead. You can go ahead and we'll come back.
Okay, so this is your early warning signs of fascism of the operated about number 13. How would you say that for the
Cronyism and corruption?
Yeah, I would like to actually see what that looks like right now.
So fascist regimes almost always are governed by groups of friends and associates who appoint each other to government positions and use governmental power and authority to protect their friends from accountability. It's not uncommon in fascist regimes for national resources and even treasures to be appropriated or even outright stolen by government leaders. For me, as a government professor, the first thing that comes to mind is Citizens United versus FEC, where they basically made it to where corporations could use an unlimited amount of funds to support a candidate, which means that a lot of our candidates now are more accountable to their donors than they are to the people, which to me that fits the definition of cronyism. They're doing favors within the government among the people who control the resources to help each other continue to control the resources. And we also call that the iron triangle. So that's what I see happening. I'm curious what you guys think.
I think, yeah, and you know, you hear about the drain the swamp, which was the big, you know, thing that President Trump said he was trying to do, which was this notion that in the DC, there are all of these embedded like people that are just career politicians, and they just hire all their friends and they get them in there. And we saw exactly that when Trump came into office. He pulled all of these people in that were mostly not qualified to do their job. I think he pulled in somebody from the EPA, I think, who wanted to disband the EPA.
Secretary of Education.
Rick Perry as energy, you know, I mean, it was just, that to me is cronyism. It's like bringing in people that I'm guessing a lot of them were big donors and were part of that, and having that, you know, these are my friends, this is what I'm gonna do. Democrats do this to some extent too. I want to say it's not just Republicans. It's just that because there's less money going to Democrats, because Democrats are less likely to cut taxes for corporations. And that's where it comes down to. It's the reason that big corporations want to support Republicans is because they will cut taxes for corporations.
I like that distinction you made too, that liberals do it as well, because a lot of times when we talk about these topics, we talk about them in absolute terms, like it either happens or it doesn't, right? But most things in political science especially are on a spectrum, right? And so like when we're talking about democracy versus non-democracy, you're probably not going to have a pure democracy, and you probably don't have an absolute non-democracy. You're somewhere in between, and when we see America start sliding towards that non-democracy, we're like, alert, 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 that's a problem, right? Same thing with cronyism. liberals do it, but where are they on the spectrum compared to conservatives right now? And if one party is leaning more towards cronyism, we might want to be alert.
There was, if you'll remember, you won't remember because you weren't alive and I wasn't either, but JFK not named his brother as the Attorney General, and then we passed a law that says you can't do that. And so that was kind of part of the fear of bringing Trump bringing his kids, and that was part of that. And I think it wasn't a brother, but it was still, and it wasn't the same type of position, but there was a lot of like, ooh, this is, yeah, the nepotism thing was, it's not quite the same as cronyism, but I kind of, to me, those seem really similar. Between cronyism and nepotism. Nepotism is family, and cronyism is friends. Your cronies, your buddies.
They're really close, they're really close, aren't they?
Marlene?
How do you see the analogy between the news media and our state government? I spend all my time in the legislature, okay, for 16 years. So I can see going and doing testimony in all the committee hearings, and depending on who the chair is and the members of the committee, the stats are all swayed. And unless people show up, there is no real transparency and putting sunlight into some of the information. But most people never go to the legislature while they're in session. Most people don't listen to the floor speeches. And most people don't understand that our governor has the largest war chest in the United States. That's political contributions. Okay.
It doesn't have lots of members.
And a lot of it is based on his appointments. You make a donation of a certain amount, you become a regent of the university. And you get to help establish.
What's your question exactly?
So how do you see, you're talking media and news outlets, how do we see that playing out also in our state government and our community government?
From my perspective, I see very little coverage of the legislature. Obviously, Houston Chronicle does some, but our local news stations are mostly covering crime. You know, if there's a really big thing going on, like, you know, when the Democrats all left town to try to avoid, what was the SBA or what they were trying to get something that they wouldn't sign.
Yeah.
What was that? Was that SBA or something else? They all went to Washington DC.
It was to break quorum.
Oh, that was the
For the
voting.
voting.
Right, so, but that made the news because it was a stunt. But the normal day-to-day of our state legislature, I don't honestly know much about it myself. I follow a little bit, but I don't. Is there a C-SPAN for state government?
Yes.
Is there?
Yes, it's on cable.
It is? I don't have cable, so.
I mean, it's even.
You don't have to? I should know this though, right? And the fact that I don't know this is like, that's the
It's all
problem.
online, it's free, and you can watch every hearing on your computer.
It feels like more of us should know that.
He asked, what is a quorum?
I didn't know it. TDA has them too. I mean, TDA, higher education, all that is public, but we have.
But it's even in our Texas government textbooks, it says that Texas is dominated by big business. And so for me, kind of the way that I see all of that is obviously if the government is being largely funded, the people who are there are representing big business, then what is going to be portrayed in our media is likely going to shine a positive light on them. And most people aren't there to actually get the context of what has actually transpired. And I know that you were asking about state, and one of the things that comes to mind for me with national government is one of the big conversations around the January 6th committee hearings is that it is a political stunt and that Republicans were kept off the committee, which actually isn't true. Kevin McCarthy actually advocated for an independent committee and asked for XYZ, like a list of a lot of things. And the House said, sure. And then at the last minute, they backed out. And so that's why they moved forward with the congressional committee. But what is being portrayed in the national media, especially on the conservative side, is Republicans didn't get a chance to say their side of the story. And so I think that that kind of goes to what you're saying as far as how our state and local government is being covered by the news, is it's going to, the media is known to have agenda setting and framing. And I think that that's exactly what you're describing, for sure.
He asked, what is a quorum?
Did you explain it?
I was going to explain it, but I'll let you explain it. A quorum, and based on committee, you have standing rules for your committees and your legislature. You have standing rules in your county government. And based on those standing rules, you can establish 2/3, or you can establish over 50% of the simple majority. And so that establishes quorum. With our county commissioners not showing up for the budget, it throws the budget back to where it was 2 years ago when it was voted in. So, but theirs is based on okay, 3 people are showing up and 2 people are not. So they're breaking quorum because they need a 4/5 vote for budget.
4/5 to be present.
To be present.
Majority vote, but 4/5 present to be.
To actually call for the question.
So then what happens?
The question can't be asked because you don't have quorum.
So state law made our tax rate go back to a certain amount with no new revenue, basically, which is problematic in a time when all prices are going up. So it's an issue. So
We have about 7 minutes left, so maybe 2 more questions. And then I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you guys might have looming. I don't know what everybody else's schedule is, but I will. So we'll go with this question first, then we'll jump back to you. Go ahead.
Well, I believe there's
Yes. There are Holocaust deniers, and what is if I am not summarizing this incorrectly, what is motivating that, and does that cause harm in trying to educate people about fascism? Was that pretty close? Yes, it does. One of the things that the Holocaust Museum in Houston is very concerned about is Holocaust denying. And that is something that the U.S. Holocaust Museum and Yad Vashem in Israel they're both worried about it too. And there is a pretty well-known Holocaust denier in Houston who shows up to certain events and pickets them basically. And also that holds events, and then people at the museum sign up to go, and then they are denied tickets. So that is happening here in this city. And when you have a person who is convinced that something has not happened, although it is the most documented event in history, and they are actively working against a side that is trying to educate people about that event, that is exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do here, which is have a dialogue. So yes, it does, and it is happening. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. I can find out.
It's also worth noting that many of the extremist groups that were part of the insurgency on January 6th were Holocaust deniers or championed the Holocaust. Many of them were wearing shirts that said 6 million wasn't enough. And so I think that also speaks to some of the political rhetoric that we're seeing, some of the political movements, and I think that does feed into my opinion on whether or not fascism is on the rise in the United States.
And by definition, Holocaust deniability is not just saying that it didn't happen, it's also saying that it wasn't as bad as, as it really was. We didn't really actually kill that many people. Now you know what I mean? So lessening the effect of it as well as the fact that it actually happened. That's also under the umbrella of deniability, according to the museums and their definition of it.
Last question.
So I'd like to hear you comment on 2 things. Replacement theory in relation to eugenics, and that was a big thing. We talked a lot about that. And then also Italy just elected a fascist woman, and their fascist cleansing wasn't like Germany. Germany used the Ritchie boys for about 60 minutes. After they conquered Germany, they had to cleanse both fascists. But I want to make a couple of quick comments. One, you want a bunch of Nazis just watching Glorious Bastards. And if you want to have an easy word to commit genocide, just watch Hotel Rwanda and cockroach, is the word there. And yes, Brene Brown, SR 10X, UH 2010, go Pushers. And as far as number 13, cronyism, Supreme Court, 6 of 9 are clever society. So you don't have to look very far, file number 13. This is Supreme Court. 6 of 9 are federal society and only 5% attorneys. So that's already there. And let's see, was there anything else? So Italy fascism back in the game and replacement theory, obviously degenerate.
Religion, government, next one, Supreme Court.
We only have like 2 minutes. So I'll let that simmer, let that last idea simmer. I'd say unless you give like a 30-second word that anybody wants to say.
I have a couple of short comments that probably aren't going to answer your question to the extent because what you asked were big questions. As far as replacement theory goes, I think that it is worth noting there's a recent study out by the University of Chicago that it's called The Face of the Insurrectionists. And they basically gathered all the data on the people who were arrested for insurrection. And the overwhelming majority were white males. There were women, there were minorities who were arrested as well, but the point that they said stood out the most as a key factor and the people who participated in the insurrection were those individuals who were arrested came from counties that had the highest level of decrease in white non-Hispanic population. So the idea of what role is the Great Replacement Theory playing, the idea that the dominant race in America is going to be replaced, I think it's pretty significant. It's a pretty motivating and mobilizing factor. And I think that data actually supports the idea that the Great Replacement Theory is very dangerous in America right now. As far as Italy electing a fascist, I've had these conversations among other political science scholars, and I don't know that much about this individual, but I can tell you what's being circulated and like the conversations I'm having is that the media is distorting the level of fascist that this person is, but that's as much as I know. I don't know if anybody else has comments they would like.
What person is the person he's talking about? The woman that was just elected.
But don't you think these definitions are evolving?
They are.
Period.
Right. So we're right at time and we don't want to hold people over that have somewhere else to be.
Yes, really fast, quick reminders. First of all, this is totally add-on. If anybody has not heard or seen the show Hadestown, it's a musical. The last song in the first act is called "Why Do We Build the Wall?" It's Hades singing a song about why are they building this wall, and it talks about like why are we trying to keep these people out. Listen to that song because it really goes well with this. It was written in 2006, by the way, not in response to Trump. Again, our dean is here. Thank you very much, Dean Lee, for being here. She was part of what makes this happen. Thank you to Josh for managing everything back there. Political Science Club. Early voting is underway right now. Thank you to League Winning Voters for being here. Vote411.org. You can do a great sample ballot. And if you live in Harris County, it's the longest ballot, I believe, in the United States, if that's correct.
Yes, that's correct.
So you can go to vote411.org. You can compare all the candidates, click the ones you like, and print out a ballot for you to bring to the polls. So I encourage you to do that. I know my students have heard me say this already. I'm actually going to show
And
you.
there are 99 voting centers.
Yes, so go vote early. Vote early, get your voting in, everybody.
Thank you guys.
Also, if you did not sign in, there's a QR code. Please scan that QR code. If your QR code reader's not working on your phone, I do have a physical sign in instead. Thank you all so much for being here. Bye.
People ask questions.
What's the second one? Are you coming tomorrow night? Yes. Oh, good. You can't be there. 7.
Slides.